Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here are your co-hosts, Doug Lesmerises and Shehan Jeyarajah. And we're back the day after. The reason this podcast exists is the college football playoff. It's Doug and Shehan, and the ratings are out. Everyone knows this. Rankings, not ratings, because it's people, not computers. It is funny. There's this BCS site that does all the old stuff from the BCS Shehan and says like, hey, here's what the BCS would be. And like a lot of times it's pretty much the same, that like the old poll voters plus computers winds up in the same thing. This is actually an example where there is a difference, that Tennessee, number one for the committee. Tennessee would not be number one in the BCS system. I think they'd be number 3, and Georgia would be number 1. You flip those two teams. Instead, we get Tennessee 1, Ohio State 2, Georgia 3, Clemson 4, Michigan 5. And I cannot believe there would be a single person listening to this podcast who would be getting that information for the first time. The rankings came out. So we know the rankings, and we're going to discuss those right off the top. At the end of this podcast, we'll kick a team out of our playoff discussion. We'll decide if we should let a team into our playoff discussion, and we'll give you our rankings. And at the middle of this podcast, we're going to break down and make picks for the Georgia-Tennessee game, because boy, is that important. But we're going to start off with a little juice. This is where everybody is. Shehan, what are you most upset about in regards to the release of the initial college football playoff rankings for the 2022 college football? See how I'm talking slow? I'm trying to calm you down heading into this segment. College football season.
Well, I have to give them credit. Every year, I think that I'm going to go in and not have very many opinions about what happens, because I don't care. It's no big deal, right? It's just a ranking. It's not the end of the world. It'll play itself out. And every single year, they find a way to make me madder. And this year, for people who are subscribers of the Apple Podcast show, we had a conversation yesterday, and one of the things that you said was that you felt like the committee might not value Tennessee as much because they aren't a balanced team. They are such an offense-heavy team, and you feel like the committee is going to punish them for that. Well, I responded by saying, no, that argument is limited for just Big 12 and Pac-12 teams. That's not something that's taken seriously for an SEC team, I don't believe, because I don't think that that's how they'd approach it. Well, here's a quote from NC State Athletic Director Boo Corrigan, the chair of the playoff committee, on ESPN yesterday. We're looking for a balanced team, offense and defense, and TCU has gotten behind in some games. They've been able to come back and win some games. But when you look at Alabama in the wins against Mississippi State, at Arkansas, at Texas, and obviously the 3-point loss at Tennessee, as a committee, we decided to go Alabama number 6 and TCU number 7. So, to be clear, Tennessee is the number 1 team in the country for being an offense-only team. And TCU is the number 7 team in the country, behind a team that has a loss and no top 20 victories because they're not balanced enough. Of course that's the case. Of course it only affects one team. Only one team is unbalanced, not other teams. That would be ridiculous if other teams were unbalanced that maybe they're evaluating as well. I was not optimistic that TCU was going to be number 6 in our rankings. But seeing TCU at 7 and Clemson at 4 was just insane to me. I don't know how you view those two things as separate teams, right? Because Clemson has also played a number of close games. They haven't had to, other than the Syracuse game, they haven't had to come back as much as TCU has. But their wins also aren't as good. And on top of that, then you have a 3-spot gap between Ohio State and Michigan. Like, I think Ohio State's better than Michigan. I think that their efficiency numbers would kind of reflect that. But to have 3 spots in between them when they have very similar resumes to this point, again, every year they manage to find a way to do this. And congratulations, committee, you've done it again.
I would just like to point out that I thought you were going to be mad about one thing, and that was at least 3. So it's good. It's good to get the anger out. So I do think the balanced discussion, it was funny to me how in the end, and I think I said it on the podcast, I think if you guys want to subscribe to the Apple Podcast show for $2.99 a month, $2.99, you get 4 bonus episodes, one every week. And we did we didn't preview the rankings entirely. That wasn't the main thing. We did predictions for November that I think was really good. But there's a brand bias with Alabama that has been part of the playoff since it started. And so it's hard to parse whether the TCU Alabama discussion is more about TCU or more about Alabama. But actually, I think it's a combination of like kind of the two main things that have permeated the playoff committee since the start, which is overrating Alabama. And most of the time, you can't overrate Alabama because you have to fairly rate Alabama because they're the best, because they're Alabama. But when they're not, and when they have problems, they aren't as dinged as much as other teams. And that's combined with sort of dinging the Big 12 for being unbalanced in a way that you don't do it to everybody else. The ironic thing about all of this is that everything you see about Tennessee, we know this. Tennessee is running an old Big 12 offense. This is the Mike Leach air raid as adapted by Josh Heupel from Oklahoma, who now is doing it at Tennessee. And the Big 12 doesn't really play offense that way anymore. The Big 12 now is a league that has a lot of great defenses. TCU certainly is an offense-first team, but they are somehow still applying the old version of Big 12 perception to TCU, when really the team that actually matches that is Tennessee. Now, the thing that happens is that a lot of things are true at once. And what they basically said is they just didn't have the balanced conversation with Tennessee because they have 2 top 10 wins. So if you have 2 top 10 wins, they don't care if you're unbalanced. So the fact that LSU was 10th and Alabama was 6th, which is higher than we thought both those teams would be, you knew Tennessee was going to be number 1, and then balance doesn't come up. But I do think in general, the way it's applied to TCU then is odd in a world where Bama practically lost to like the 5th best team in the Big 12, and the best team in the Big 12 is ranked behind them when Bama actually does have a loss. So I do think that's a reasonable thing to be upset about. Let me ask you about one of the other things you mentioned, because as you know, people know my roots are covering Ohio State football. I've done that since 2005. So there are more Ohio State people who pay attention to this maybe than some other programs, just like there's a bunch of Baylor people and Big 12 people and people in Texas who pay attention because, you know, you're very famous there. Your tweet about Ohio State being 2 and Michigan being 5, and they both have like wins, like their kind of only good win is against Penn State, and Michigan was actually a little more dominant than Ohio State, raised some hackles among the Ohio State fan base. Is your primary discussion point there that you think Michigan should be higher in relation to Ohio State because you think they're kind of similar cases? Or what is your primary point you are making with that observation?
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest thing is I view Ohio State and Michigan as being in the same tier right now. I view all of them as top 4 teams. I think that they're in the same tier with Georgia and Tennessee as well. I think that that's, to me, the top 4. I think there's a gap between everybody else. Again, I mentioned, I think Ohio State right now is better than Michigan. But it's funny, like you said, we had this conversation, and obviously, again, I'm formed by this discussion back when it happened in 2014 and 15. You know, back in 2014, there was all this complaints that, well, you know, yet they're winning by these teams, TCU and Baylor are winning by a lot of points, but they're scoring a lot of points and they're allowing a lot of points. And does that really, you know, should that be a benefit? You know, with Michigan, we kind of have the opposite of that. We have the 2012 Alabama. We have the 2021 Georgia, where, you know, a game is 29-7, but that game was a total suffocation, for example. And we're seeing them be dinged, whereas Ohio State is getting credit for winning by a lot of points because they have a dynamic offense. You know, so it's just this. It's just this changing of the way that you view a team based on, and I think the frustration to me is that it is clearly kind of changing how you view the discussion based on just who you thought was good in the first place. Now, again, I think Ohio State is good. I think that their numbers would stack up with anybody else, but I don't know how you can, like, one thing that people brought up was, oh, well, you know, but look at that Iowa-Michigan score. That game was never in doubt. It was 20-0. It was 27-7. And then Iowa scored a meaningless touchdown with 6 seconds left. Like, these games were all never in doubt. And honestly, the Penn State game for Ohio State was a lot more competitive. So like, you look at the context, of course, like this is all part of it, but I just don't view them as being in a separate tier. When I put out sort of my rankings, and we'll get to them later, how we do them for the committee, but like, I have Ohio State 2. I have Michigan 4. I think that there is a little bit of a gap between them in terms of, I just think Ohio State's a slightly better team, but to have them behind Clemson at 4,
to have Michigan behind Clemson is really where the point takes hold for you.
Yeah, that's where I have a huge issue, because I don't view Clemson as being part of this discussion at all. They've played multiple competitive games against teams that really a top 4 team should not have been competitive against. And, they haven't beaten a team in the top 20. I don't know what exactly Clemson has done that is so much less impressive than Ohio State. Because if you want to say that they've got whatever it is, 3 ranked wins, well, Ohio State doesn't have that. But, you're giving credit to Ohio State for being better and having the best win for beating Penn State. But then you're not giving that same credit to Michigan. It's just clearly 2 different standards.
So I do think there is a differentiator there that I do think I'll include that when we get to the thing that has the most impact. In terms of the thing we agree with the most, do you have any?
Yeah, I do.
So let me say this. I'm old. And in 2014, again, this is why I think you and I are the right people maybe to do this show. We were in the guts of this thing from the jump. This is a person who's covered Ohio State and a person who went to and has covered Baylor. And that was the discussion the first time around in the college football playoff. So that first year when we were trying to figure stuff out and how they're going to do this and what the committee is going to value and how far you can move up and all those things, we were right there. Not that the whole world wasn't, but it was just like an hourly fixation for those 2 programs, Baylor and Ohio State in 2014. I'm kind of over it, which is probably not a great thing for a person who is a co-host of a college football playoff themed show to say. But there is a part of, we've had every argument. There is nothing left to say. We've figured them out, which is there's so much information you wind up picking in the moment what you decide to value, but there's 10 other things that might contradict your opinion. And then you get a person on TV who tries to explain what 13 people think like it's one person, and almost all the time it works itself out on the field anyway. The whole part of the 12-team playoff discussion, there's what it does to the regular season, there's opening up opportunity, but there's also ending this. Can we be done with this part of it? Because the mental gymnastics that everybody does, and then everybody comes in hot, and everybody is on one hand saying, it doesn't matter, but also here's why I'm right and you're an idiot. And it's like we're in the year 9 of this. And I do think there will be a time when we look back and say, remember when everybody just fought about that stuff? It's fun. I do think it's fun. And that's the other thing is people say, oh, why do you care about it? It's because there's lots of silly things in the world that people care a lot about that don't matter at all. If we were a species that only cared about things that mattered, we'd either be incredibly productive or incredibly boring, or probably both. So don't apply your standard of don't talk about it because it doesn't matter to only the college football rankings, because then just stop watching reality television. So I felt that Tuesday night kind of in the moment. And I was like, this is because it's great. Georgia, Tennessee is going to happen. Ohio State, Michigan is going to happen. There's a couple things that do matter. As we said, this is the second most important rankings. But man, it made me ready for the 12-team playoff just to have a different lens on the discussion, right? Because it'll be interesting for seeding. We'll be really curious about, hey, that battle for the 9, 10, 11 spots for teams that might have 2 losses. But it'll change the discussion a little bit. And I think we're all kind of done with, I don't know that there's a new version of the current discussion in year 9 of this. So thanks for listening. That was the last podcast. This is it. We're just cutting this one short at 15 minutes and we're folding up tents. But here's my point. The thing that I agree with the most, and even though I still think it's not necessarily what I would have done, and it may not reflect my rankings, which now that we have playoff rankings out at the end, I'm just going to try to think like a committee member. Whatever we were trying to think about before or not think about, it's now it's we're a committee of 2, as we said before. Everybody. So the idea that nobody in the world has Tennessee number one. No group has Tennessee number one, right? But the Group That Matters does is a reminder that this group is better than a lot of the other incarnations of things we have tried to do in the past, because we have reached the point where it's like, the coaches poll and the AP poll, well, they're just still going to have Georgia or Alabama because they're, whatever. They're not going to have Tennessee number one. But then when it's like the committee and most people's predictions, and it wasn't mine, and I realized I was going to be wrong. But you were right. A lot of people are like, they're going to have Tennessee. And it's like, well, why are they going to have Tennessee? Why is the Group That Matters going to have Tennessee when no other groups have Tennessee? Well, because Tennessee actually deserves it. And that's where we are. We have to remember that with the playoff committee, nobody was surprised when Tennessee was number one. But then why isn't Tennessee number one anywhere else? Because we also have come to accept the fact that the coaches poll and the AP poll are a bunch of dunderheads who are caught up on reputation. And the committee is less so. So that is worth a celebration. It is worth a reminder, because if it was so obvious, then Tennessee would be an overwhelming number one in both polls, and they are certainly not. They're barely tied for second in the AP poll, right? They had to beat Kentucky by 430 to move up the tied for second. So let's give those 13 people the credit they deserve for that, because we now accept it as the norm of like, the smart people that actually consider everything that matters, they'll have Tennessee number one, but the poll voters, Georgia won it last year. So that, we can't stare the obvious in the face. And it looks like I have earrings in my headphones. So here's the thing. I used to have these giant pink headphones that would wrap over my head, and I broke them. So now I have these earbuds.
I was wondering where they went.
I broke them. They're not Apple, but they're a different brand, and they fall out of my ear 30 times a podcast. I mean, you're constantly watching me, like I'm catching it in one hand. I can barely hear. Do things stick in your ear? I think my ears are misshapen.
No, my ears are fully misshapen, which is actually, my headphones are like the clip-on type. They're the Beats, Power Beats headphones or whatever. And so they have like a hook on them because things do not stay in my ear whatsoever. I can't do, my wife has AirPods. She has like both generations. She just got the new ones. Neither of them stay in my ear. I need the clip-on ones, even just sitting here.
Okay, no, I need to hook them too. And the other thing that happened to me is when I started wearing these and all the time, because I broke the other headphones, my ears, the inside of my ears were like tingling 24 hours a day. And I was like, do I have a disease? What is happening? And I was like overstimulating the hairs in my ears because everything was too loud all the time. And it was like having an effect, and it felt like my ears were clogged all the time, and all the little hairs were like, turn down the volume, brother. Like, what are you doing to us? So I'm having a lot of trouble, but it also, it's a bit of an odd look for me. Some people can pull off earrings. I've always wondered whether a 49-year-old middle-aged guy could just go get like earrings and pull it off. And I think it's a pretty definitive no, because also by the time my grandfather passed away, his earlobes stretched to his shoulders. And so my lobes, I know I have extended lobes in my future, and I don't want droopy lobes probably with an earring in them. So I think that's just going to be a thing that I'm never going to experience, because I'm not sure this would be the look for me. What do you think? No, probably not. We can be honest.
It's all about confidence. It's all about confidence. I got mine done. I didn't know how it was gonna look, and it looks pretty good. So you know what? It's all about confidence. You just gotta get yourself out there. You just listen. You're about to, your kids are about to go off to college. You're gonna, Act 2, Doug, should be the Doug that has earrings.
Okay, I'll do it. Fine, I'll do it. Actually, we'll put it to a poll of our college football Survivor show, and should Doug get his ears pierced or not. Okay, so credit, I don't want to overlook the first thing, which is they probably got the number one team right in a world where nobody else has.
Yeah. No, and that was exactly what I was going to say. I am very pleased that Tennessee is number one. I think that fits right within the criteria they've laid out. I think that, if it's supposed to be about your resume and who wins the actual games, I mean, Tennessee is that team. Tennessee has gone out and beaten teams. They've been dominant when doing it. This past week, they beat a pretty good Kentucky team 44-6. They obviously beat Alabama at home and got key stops when they needed to. In that LSU game, I think is only going to continue to age better, though I might have some thoughts about LSU that we might get to in a second. But for them to have, like you mentioned, 2 top 10 victories, nobody else really comes even that close to that. And I think that Tennessee, based on the criteria they've laid out, is the obvious number 1 team. And I'm glad that they kind of stuck to it. And at least in this case, didn't kind of get blinded by a brand. Now, Tennessee's a brand. They won a title not that long ago. They're one of the sort of traditional powers in college football too. But, I like that in Tennessee's case, they didn't wait and see. They said, look, you have the resume right now. We're not going to sit and wait for you to have to go through and beat not just Alabama, but also Georgia before we take you seriously. I think they deserve to be taken seriously now. And by the way, this does set up a very interesting game of the century type game, because these teams are number 1 and 2 in the AP poll, Georgia and Tennessee. But you also kind of get a 1v1 matchup with number 1 in the playoff rankings and number 1 in the AP poll. So that should be kind of fun.
That actually, I bet you somebody will have that. How often have 2 teams who were separately ranked number 1 in different rankings that were acknowledged as being legit played each other in the regular season? Like how often would you have ever had a coaches versus AP regular season 1v1? Oh, that's a very good point. That makes me want to investigate that. Or actually, it makes me want someone else to investigate that and then tweet about it so that I can talk about it on the show. So that's a really good point. When we talk about actual impact, right? So there's the things that get you fired up. There's the thing that you say, okay. And then there's the things like, again, the clues that we are looking for that, okay, now things are going to happen. A lot's going to be decided on the field. But if they get down to a point where for the 4th spot, they are picking between teams with very similar resumes, we got a clue about which way they might lean or whatever, anything like that. Because if it's not settled on the field, if there's muddiness, what did you learn the most? What's the actual impact that was the number 1 thing from the rankings released on Tuesday night?
Yeah, for me, the most impactful thing that I learned is that LSU has a path to the college football playoff.
Whoa, BK.
They are ranked number 10 in the country right now, despite having 2 losses, including a 40-13 loss to Tennessee, which is fine. And their other loss was, oh my gosh, you guys remember that Florida State game at the beginning of the year? That was a crazy game. And it wasn't that bad a loss. It's whatever. But
what? Well, it was an incredibly incompetent, both major powers, traditional powers, neither of whom wanted to win the game and couldn't figure out how to play football. So in that sense, it kind of was a bad loss. But it's like they have a loss to the number 1 team where they got blown off the field, which you can dismiss. And then they have just like, there's almost a goofiness to that loss that seems like it is aiding them.
Yeah. And I mean, and frankly, I think that that's fine, right? Like, I don't think that whatever analytics style, whatever that LSU is 27 points worse than Tennessee. Like, I don't, they're much worse. They're notably worse, but that's fair. If you want to view it that way, that's fair. And like, the rest of their schedule is pretty good. They beat Ole Miss by a lot in their last game. They play Alabama this upcoming week. But what this sets up is that if LSU goes and beats Alabama this week, then they will be right on the edge of the top 4. And it sets up that when the SEC championship game comes around, no matter who comes out of the East and no matter who comes out of the West, both will be favored to make the college football playoff. That's kind of where we're at right now. That's going to be a guaranteed play-in game for the playoff.
Not if LSU loses the SEC championship game, they're not getting in with 3. Yeah.
If LSU wins that game, they're a lock. If Georgia wins that game, they're a lock. If Tennessee wins that game, they're a lock. If Alabama wins that game, they're a lock. And it also, of course, sets up a situation where I think that the second place team in the SEC East, or Tennessee or Georgia, if they lose that game, still have a very good chance of getting in.
So I guess the question is, so that had been the thing. We've never had a 2-loss team in. And the question of a 2-loss SEC champ is a very interesting discussion. And like, would the committee be capable of leaving out the SEC champion? It would have to be. I mean, the scenario is like what happened in 2016 when Penn State was a 2-loss Big Ten champ, and the team that it beat Ohio State, and then Penn State beat Ohio State and won the Big Ten, but it had 2 losses, and Ohio State only had the 1 loss, and Ohio State got in and Penn State didn't. So that's the scenario of, would they ever do that to an SEC champ? They left out a 2-loss Big Ten champ, but they didn't leave out the Big Ten. They just said, we're taking the non-champ instead of the champ. So the scenario would have been LSU beats Georgia or Tennessee in the SEC championship game, but somehow that loser still gets in ahead of LSU, or it would be very complicated. I think probably I would have, if we had reached that point, even if LSU was 14 right now, if we had reached that point, I think I would have said, well, because you can't leave out the head-to-head part of it in the championship game. It was easier to leave out Penn State and put in Ohio State because they did not play in the actual championship game, to sort of have a championship game and then ignore it and say, well, you played the championship game, but we're still taking the team that lost over the team that won. I don't know if it would be as easy to do that. I do think in the end, that scenario probably takes the 4th spot away from the Tennessee-Georgia loser, right? It's not going to be 3 SEC teams. But I think in general, that's a interesting scenario that I think probably would have happened anyway. But your point is making us think about it now. And LSU being this high is making us thinking about it now. Plus, as you said, if they beat the teams they have to beat to get there, they're going to keep moving up the rankings anyway.
Well, and I think, though, that another part of this is, okay, let's say that Alabama was 7 instead of 6, right? And TCU was ahead of them, like I think they should be. Well, LSU, and let's say that LSU, I think that they're at 15 in the AP right now. You know, if the number 15 team beats a number 7 team this weekend, that's nice. But then they play at Arkansas, UAB, at Texas A&M to close the year. That's not super exciting. So, like, they're probably heading into the SEC title game as, like, the number 10 team in the country, most likely, in that scenario where they're sitting at 15 to start. Well, now they're sitting at 10. If they beat Alabama, they probably move up to, like, 6. Like, they probably find a way to jump in front of TCU, too, because that's just that's just life. And then all of a sudden, they're right there on the edge, as opposed to maybe getting into this discussion at the end if they do make the SEC championship game and find a way to win. So I think that it makes it a lock that if LSU wins out, they are in as a 2-loss team. I think that they are absolutely 100% a lock if they win the SEC.
Well said. I think that matters, and I think that's real. Well, my 2 things are, so I saw some people talk about it. I do not think that this is any indication that an undefeated TCU team would be left out of the playoff. I don't think that's what this is, because TCU has 4 regular season games remaining. One of them is against a team that's currently ranked against number 24, Texas. That Baylor win will be a solid win if they do that. And then the Big 12 championship game that TCU would play the next best team is going to be a very good team. And if it's Kansas State is number 13 in the rankings right now. So they're going to have like 2 more very good wins. And yes, 7 right now is probably too low for TCU, but I do not think this sets up some kind of, just because Alabama's ahead now, that it really is some indication that we could be in a world where it's SEC champ, ACC champ, Big Ten champ, and then TCU's undefeated but loses out to the second team in the SEC. I just don't think they would, because I think over time we've seen the committee do it, that you're one thing, and then when you win the conference championship, you're another thing. And that but they don't like acknowledge that until the crown's on your head. And so 13-0 and the crown's on your head changes the equation in that room and in that discussion. I think we've seen that time and time again. So I think to look at it now and overdo what you think TCU behind Alabama means, I don't think that's the right read on that, even though I think it's fair to be like, come on. But I think it's more a come on than like, oh no, in that Bama TCU head to head.
Here's what I'll say, though. TCU being number 7 at undefeated, whereas Bama 6 at 1 loss without really, I mean, what's their best win? It's Texas, I guess. Like that's probably what you're pointing to in a game where they played their backup quarterback, which, by the way, is the criticism people keep levying against TCU. So my issue is this. Typically, if you have a 12-1 conference champion, you are in a really good spot to get in. What this tells me, with TCU being number 7, is that TCU is 100% eliminated if they lose any games. 100%. Not even consideration at that point. And you look at the rest of the Power 5 conference championship contenders, none of the others are being treated that way. So TCU right now is being treated with 0 losses like they already have a loss, right? They're being treated like Oregon right now, which Oregon has a loss, which is fine. I mean, it was a loss to the number 3 team in the country, but they're being treated as if they already have a loss despite not having a loss. And let's say hypothetically, that Baylor game, revenge spot, rivalry game on the road, all that. Let's say they lose a really close game and then dominate Kansas State, dominate Texas to close the year, finish 12-1, have 4 ranked wins at that point, beat Kansas State twice, crushed Oklahoma State, all this stuff. I think that they're not even in the discussion at that point. They might not even be in the top 6 graphic at that point at 12-1. They're being treated more like Cincinnati than they are like any other power conference team that they're usually compared to, despite having this many quality wins.
All right, that's probably right. So, like, the thing I said I think is also true. Like, because I did see someone bring up hey, that 13-0 might be left out. I said, no, it's not.
Yeah, they're not getting left out at 13-0, most likely.
They are on a you've got to win out path already. I think you could read that. Now, the thing that's hard is they do consider like head-to-head matchups, and so this wouldn't be a head-to-head matchup, but they do also think about this. You have the Alabama-Texas data point, and TCU has not yet played Texas, but if TCU blows Texas with Quinn Ewers off the field, that becomes, I think, that's a data point that they can compare TCU and Alabama directly, except that's really not going to matter in the end because, as everybody knows, if Bama wins out, it's in. If Bama loses, it's not in. So there's not really a poll discussion, a rankings discussion with Alabama, because if they're the 1-loss SEC champ, they might be the 1 seed. And if they lose to LSU this week, they probably aren't even making the SEC championship game. Or if they win out and get there and lose to Georgia and Tennessee, and they have 2 losses now, they're going to be 3rd in the pecking order of SEC teams to get in, and they're not taking 3 SEC. So I think TCU eventually may win the head-to-head rankings battle with Alabama, which is kind of important, except in the end, it's not going to matter because it's not going to be about rankings with Bama. It's going to be about whether they do it on the field or not. The other thing that I did take away is they really did punish Michigan for the non-conference. And I do think there is a difference here, and I think it probably is discussed in the committee room. There's a difference between scheduling a bunch of crappy teams and scheduling a good team that turns out not to be as good as you thought. And so I do think that's a data point difference between Ohio State and Michigan. Even though Notre Dame's not as good as everyone expected, Notre Dame is still obviously better than anyone Michigan's played. But even it's like not Ohio State's fault that Notre Dame had a quarterback injury, has a first-year head coach, had some goofy stuff, right? Whereas Michigan knew Hawaii, Colorado State, and UConn were going to stink. And so punishing, this is really a punishment. And they said it. This is what Boo Corrigan said multiple times. The non-conference schedule, honestly, is why Michigan is 5. And so if you're looking for Ohio State and Michigan have some similar things, that's something that's not similar. And they also called Michigan's offense workmanlike. And Ohio State's explosive, which is so now do you just hate it if people run the ball? Sometimes the things they say, it's why did you say it that way? Because I do think in the end, the thing the committee likes the best is a high scoring offense, but a team that also plays at least some defense. That's their number one thing they love. So Ohio State has a chance to reflect that maybe better than anybody else. But the thing that hurt Michigan the most is not being workmanlike. Running the ball it's like a hard hat situation there. And the other one is more like a dynamite. Okay, we get it. The non-conference killed them. And so it's a reminder to everybody, hey, if you care about you're in a battle as a 2-loss team to get into the 10 spot of the 12-team playoff, if you're trying for seeding, schedule better non-conference. I like that reminder because I think that came clear. That was loud. That was no doubt about that. Loud and clear from the committee of that's why you're 5. That's why you're 5. If they had played, and I know they had UCLA on the schedule and it got canceled. If they had beaten UCLA, they might be 3. They'd definitely be 4. But that's why they're 5 and Clemson's 4. That's it. Their schedule was so bad, which we knew, but you didn't know how they'd take it into account. And they absolutely knocked Michigan down for that.
Yeah, no, and I think that one of my things with all of this too is that I do feel like the explanations tend to make it worse, right? Like I think that almost there's I can't think of like one time that the chairperson said something to explain why something was ranked the way that it was, and it made things better. It almost always makes it worse. Because if, for example, they had come out for TCU and said, look, this is a team that, you know, was losing games and then teams lost players to injuries and they played banged up versions of those teams. Like that's like a legitimate thing to say. That's a legitimate criticism that TCU has played banged up teams and kind of caught teams at the right time. But like to just kind of say, oh, well, you know, like they're just one-sided. By the way, Tennessee's our number one team in the nation. That's ridiculous, right? Like that's a completely illogical way to look at this, you know, and same sort of deal with Michigan, right? I think that B. Corrigan did, like you mentioned in the call after the show, say, look, we feel like Michigan has played a really weak strength of schedule, and clearly the non-conference schedule counted against them, which I'm glad it did because it was really bad. I mean, it was three of the bottom. Actually, I will give credit to UConn; they might make a bowl game, but other than that, yeah, it's
UConn beat Boston College.
Yeah, that's oof. Things are not going super well there for Jeff Hafley right now, but I think that you know that's fine. But to criticize their offense as workmanlike and I'm like the guy who I probably don't take Michigan as seriously typically as I should. You know, I think that there's probably more of a case that they belong in that top level discussion. But I mean, to kind of dismiss them like that because they are dominant defensively and they hold on to the ball offensively, and that's what they're trying to accomplish. And by the way, I mean, one of the most impressive things that happened to me that benefits Michigan is seeing Penn State really make that Ohio State offense struggle, because it shows me, oh, this is a really good defense, and Michigan made them look like nothing. They ran all over them.
That's not exactly true. The Michigan-Penn State game was 16-14 at halftime. The Ohio State-Penn State game was 16-14 at the end of three quarters. Michigan exploded in the middle of the third quarter with two 60-yard touchdown runs. Ohio State exploded in the middle of the fourth quarter with some big pass plays and a big touchdown run and some defensive plays. So Michigan put Penn State away a quarter earlier than Ohio State did. But I mean, that's a very competitive game at halftime. So I do think there has been a thing of like Michigan ran all over them. Like yards per play, Ohio State had more yards per play against Penn State than Michigan did. So I do think that characterization is not quite right. Both were games for a time and then got blown open. Yes, to Michigan's credit, they blew it open faster. But I think those two games are actually more similar than people realize.
Sure. No, but I think that for me, right, that means that Michigan, what they're doing offensively is in some way comparable to Ohio State is more what I mean.
No, yeah, for sure. Like one's a great passing team, one's a great running team, and they're both dominant in those things they do. And then the other thing they do, the opposite, is okay. And could be better. Ohio State running it, Michigan throwing it. But Michigan running the ball is a force, man. Absolute force. And it shouldn't be downgraded compared to being an absolute force in the pass game. Why is that not as good?
Right. No, and that's what I'm saying is I think that I learned more about Michigan's offense from Penn State playing Ohio State than I did from Michigan playing Penn State. Because it told me, oh my gosh, running for 418 yards. And like you said, there were some breakaway scores. And it was a competitive game. It wasn't 41-17 in real life, right? But to run for 400 yards against that Penn State defense, finish with 563 yards, that tells me, oh, this Michigan offense is actually very good. I have less questions long-term about Michigan's defense than I do about Ohio State's defense. I think that Michigan's defense is a little better. And so if these things are comparable, that actually said a lot to me about what Michigan is. And I probably haven't been taking it seriously enough.
No, I do think in the end that Michigan-Penn State game is more about Michigan and less about Penn State. And I do think maybe some of the initial reaction was like, Penn State's not what we thought. They're kind of a fraud. It's like, I was at the Ohio State-Penn State game. Like, Penn State's pretty good. Like, Penn State has skill guys, and Penn State has a real secondary, and like they'll get after you. Like they're pretty stinking tough. So I came away with a lot of respect for Penn State, which then I do think then you go back and transitive. It's like, man, that is a lot of respect for how the way Michigan attacks it. Just like you have respect for how the Ohio State offense in the end worked it out and scored 28 points in 9 minutes at the end of the game. Because when Ohio State explodes, even against a really good defense. When Michigan grinds you down, even against a really good defense. But the characterization, again, as you said, and this is the thing I said, again, year 9, we know this by now. The decisions are pretty good. There's always a couple things to quibble with. They get caught a little bit with being a little brand centric at times. They have some things they lean toward, but the decisions are pretty good. And then the way they talk about it is ridiculous and shoots themselves in the foot and leads to all these podcast conversations. So, and again, the whole thing of like that we have, and it's credit to ESPN because they don't pull punches. It's like, hey, we're ESPN. We attempt to run college football. We created this television show so we can have rankings, so we can talk about it. We have access to the person who represents the committee. We have them on. They ask them very legitimate questions. I always think Reese Davis always covers the topics everybody's talking about. Bang, bang, bang. He gets right to the nut, does a really good job. And then that committee person leaves, and then they have a roundtable discussion where they rip everything and talk about how ridiculous it is and how nothing makes sense, and they make it up as they go. And it is just like, it's farcical almost. It's like, I guess it's no different than any other panel discussion about any other topic in the world that happens on television these days. But anyway, so it's where we are. And again, I will be kind of happy when like this version of the discussion is dead in the 12-team playoff. And then we'll have another version of the discussion. We can do that for 10 years and then get sick of that and then have a 36-team playoff. All right, when we come back, let's talk about on the field. Let's talk about deciding some stuff on the field. A Tennessee-Georgia breakdown next on the College Football Survivor Show.
Don't miss the College Football Survivor Show bonus episode this week. Available only on Apple Podcasts.
Game wrecker. What JT did against Penn State, like Ohio State had not really seen that kind of thing since Chase Young left. And so an individual performance like that, it's directly tied to J.J. McCarthy. Because one of the problems Ohio State had against like a slippery quarterback and Taquan Finn and Toledo early in the year was they were right there. They didn't get him down. And JT Tuimoloau was one of the guys who was right on the edge, be a half a foot away, and Finn would escape and be gone. Against Penn State, he didn't miss anything. He was everywhere. He was in passing lanes. He was beating offensive tackles. He was dominant. J.J. McCarthy is going to be doing some stuff in that game, and Ohio State needs defensive players who can wreck that.
Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts for exclusive College Survivor Show bonus episodes.
It's Doug and Shehan. Be a Twitter follower. CFB Survivor Show. I always retweet the most outrage things that Shehan fires off immediately when things happen on a Saturday or happen on a Tuesday night. And he's like, okay, I got things for you people to hear. Plus we have the votes and all those kind of things. So we'd love to have you as a follower there. You get to sort of help make the show. So Georgia, Tennessee started off as like a 12-point line, and it is a moving. 12.5 was the opening line. It has moved a ton towards Tennessee. It's down to 8.5. Georgia is favored by 8.5 in this game, but like a 4-point move is a pretty big move.
That's a huge move.
Yeah. And so I think people are really coming on. I don't know how much, like specifically, I don't know how it's moved, but certainly the Nolan Smith injury for Georgia as one of the more dominating defensive players on a dominating defense is real. And he is out for the year with the pec injury. It's really disappointing. He's a really good player, former number 1 recruit in the country. He's only 11th in snaps for them, but he is their highest graded defensive player for the year on PFF. He's just like he's like an edge guy that matters. And he's been one of these guys, only played 5 snaps against Florida. He's been one of, because he got hurt. He's been one of these guys that like really came in super high profile, didn't like explode right off the bat, and has stayed around and become like a really good player for them. So the thing that I think is interesting, and obviously this is mostly about the Georgia defense versus the Tennessee offense, Shehan. Georgia, as usual, is really deep, but Tennessee goes tempo and tries to keep you from substituting. So I do think the Nolan Smith injury, it's not enough on itself to make you change, I think, how you view the game, but I think it really matters. And Tennessee, I think, is going to take away a little bit of one of the things that Georgia does best, which is play a bunch of dudes, and especially on that defensive line. And I think it's not coincidental. It's like their plan is to make you not be able to sub and keep guys on the field and wear you down and attack you with RPOs. And by the way, Tennessee runs the ball a ton. They don't run it great. I think it's 4.6 yards per carry, but they absolutely run it. They're not chucking it 70 times a game as much as they're an air raid team in a lot of ways. I think Tennessee's offense like absolutely has a chance to put this Georgia defense in a bind. Absolutely has a chance to make Georgia look mortal when it's hard for offenses to make the Georgia defense look that way.
I think that one factor that I'm going to be really curious about is, can Tennessee hit some of those home run plays against Georgia? Because that's how they beat Alabama, right? I mean, Jalen Hyatt broke off a bunch of big plays. And, this Georgia defense, I actually did some work. And by the way, check out a story that should be out by now at cbssports.com. I kind of compare statistically this 2022 Tennessee team to 2019 LSU. Not to say that they're as good, that's not the point, but just to kind of see, hey, how are they doing it? What's happening here? How did they build their team? How do they structure their team? And one thing that surprised me when I went and looked at the numbers was Georgia actually has allowed some really lengthy pass plays. They've actually allowed 6 plays through the air of more than 40 yards, which is right in the middle of the pack in the country. That's not something I would have expected. So this has been a Georgia defense that has been susceptible at times. You're playing some young guys back there. Keely Ringo, obviously a very talented cornerback, but still a sophomore at this point. Malachi Starks, a free safety who we talked about a little bit on the Tuesday show. Really, really good player, but a true freshman. So I think that that's going to be what this is about, is can Tennessee get over the top of this defense? It's, I think that Tennessee will be able to compete against the front, but if Tennessee is trying to win short, they're going to lose the game. They're just going to straight up lose the game. They have to be explosive. They have to make Georgia chase, because I think that also changes the script from a Georgia offense perspective as well. It means that they have to go down the field. It means they have to pass the ball maybe a little more downfield than they would like. They've really been in their bag when they've been able to keep things close, really involve Brock Bowers in the intermediate passing game. Stetson Bennett doesn't have a huge arm, but he's very accurate in the intermediate passing game. If they can get them out of rhythm, if they can force them to have to strike just a little bit quicker, I think that's really the pathway to victory for Tennessee. Heading into this week, I probably didn't think that Tennessee was going to be able to compete. But after looking at some of the numbers, after looking at some of the ways that this stuff has been done, and I think the Nolan Smith injury is probably the cherry on top, I think Tennessee can absolutely win this game.
You look at the back end, and again, as much as I was talking about Georgia substituting, 4 guys in the back end, Malachi Starks, who you had on the Apple show as your most important defensive player in November in the playoff race, true freshman corners, played 400 snaps as a first-year guy. He's played more than any Georgia defensive player. But Keely Ringo, Malachi Starks, Kamari Lassiter, and Chris Smith is playing as well as any safety in the country. They don't come off the field. So it's like those 4 guys are out there every single snap, and they are going to be out there dealing with Brew McCoy and Cedric Tillman and Jalen Hyatt. And Cedric Tillman was out for a little bit, and he is back from an ankle injury, and that is a huge deal for them. And when Tennessee puts those 3 guys on the field, it is going to be those 3 Tennessee receivers against the back end of the Georgia defense. They're going to have shots at big plays. And this is one of those things. It could come down to a couple 50-50 balls, right? It could come down to like coverage is there, the ball's in the air, who makes a play 2 or 3 times. Because I do think this is going to be a super competitive game. I think it's a little lower scoring, right? Georgia wins. If it's a shootout in the 50s, Tennessee's going to win. But it's more complex than that, because the other side of this is Tennessee last week, kind of denied Will Levis, right? And so to hold Kentucky to 6 in that game, and Will Levis, I think, had under 100 passing yards. Is that right? In that Tennessee-Kentucky game, that I think is something. And so one of the things, and I think I forgot to mention this in the among the thing the playoff committee chair says, there was definitely a phrase I don't know if it was it was timely defense that was referenced, I think, in Tennessee because they rank so low compared to the other top teams defensively, by EPA per game or per play. They're like in the 60s, where Georgia and Michigan and Ohio State and Alabama are all in the top 10. And they talked about timely defense. And it's like, okay, well, like, what are we doing now? Now it's like, well, they had like an 8-minute stretch there in the one game where they got a couple 3 and outs. It's like, okay, like how much are we going to parse this stuff? But the Tennessee pass defense is like the number one thing that you would say, I don't know about those guys. They're 103 in an EPA pass defense, 103 in the nation, which is awful. But doing that to Kentucky last week, like, are they changing? Like, are they better than we think? Like, are they? And again, this is Stetson Bennett. It's not Bryce Young. And Stetson Bennett has been very, very good at times in his career, for sure. But if you get in a shootout, Hendon Hooker versus Stetson Bennett, maybe this Tennessee pass defense is just good enough to make it that Stetson Bennett won't be able to hang in a situation like that. So I don't know. It does seem like maybe the thing that Tennessee is the worst at, they're getting a little better at.
Yeah, and I think that phrase "timely defense," while it's kind of funny, is probably right.
Hold me closer, timely defense.
I do think that there's some merit to that. One of the things, again, make sure and check out this piece at CBSSports.com. I spent way too long on it. Tennessee's really good on third downs. They're top 15 in the country on third downs. They get teams off the field when they need to. They as a team are +8 in turnovers, right? So like they've done the right things typically. And in those moments, they've stepped up. And one of the things that you realize, and again, this whole situation is so funny because this 2022 Tennessee team is kind of just a 2014 or an SEC version of the 2014 Baylor team, because they've run basically the same system. They're not even really an air raid team. They're more of a Baylor offense team with the way that they run the ball. And defensively, they're structured very similarly, where it's about situational football. It's about getting teams off the field on third down. It's about getting stops in the red zone. And Tennessee's been pretty good at that. And obviously one is given more credit than the other, but that's beside the point. So I think that, I think that the biggest goal for this Tennessee defense is just to find a way to get the ball back to the offense and let them cook, right? It's to create as many possessions as possible. It's to create as many opportunities as possible. And look, they're, I think, number 70 or something like that in yardage defense. They're never going to be good in yardage defense when they're defending this many plays, but their 5.2 yards per play allowed is right in line with like Kentucky and Texas A&M, who we both consider to be very good defenses. So I think that their defense is good enough to accomplish what they want and need to accomplish.
And Jalen McCullough, one of their good safeties, missed the Alabama game, had an off-field issue that got sorted out. He's back. He played against Kentucky, played pretty well against Kentucky. The version of the Tennessee secondary that got toasted by Bryce Young, they had some guys out that game. Now, some of those guys are still out, but they had some guys out. They're better than that. So if your baseline is like, man, I mean, but also they're not playing Bryce Young.
Yeah, also Bryce Young is very good.
Also Bryce Young, we like to talk about Bryce Young because, oh mama, he can play some football. But so yes, Georgia is not capable of doing the same things offensively that Alabama can do. And also, I think Tennessee's in a better spot defensively than Tennessee was against Alabama. So I don't think that means that this game's going to be 50-49. So then you get into that world. The Hendon Hooker part of this is like, oh, duh. Hey, what's Doug's big point? The guy who might win the Heisman, might win the game for them. He's just so dangerous. He is so dangerous. And as you said, they really have modified this air raid. They throw to the tight end more. They have a lot of RPO stuff worked in there. You can see them just rip people apart with the RPO game. And then if you think you get pressure on him, he takes off. And he will turn a 5-yard sack into a 10-yard game. And that is exactly the kind of thing that wins games like this. It's like, well, there was that 3rd and 8 where we got pressure and we had 2 guys had hands on him and he got out and got a first down. And that in the middle of the 3rd quarter of a 1-score game. That's absolutely how these games are won. And he is absolutely a player who was incredibly capable of doing that. And again, they had a stretch where they did not have Cedric Tillman arguably their best receiver. Now he's back. They put, just like Ohio State does, they put 3 game-breaking receivers on the field every single snap, and their quarterback's also a game breaker. And I don't know if anybody can stop that. And I do think it's one of these things, Shehan. We are coming around on this. Ohio State's really good. I think Ohio State is still the best team in the country. I completely understand, even though I might still have Ohio State number 1 for some various reasons. Obviously, the case that Tennessee makes is almost impeachable when you look at the 2 best wins that they have. But I still think Ohio State is the best team. But if Tennessee is not quite as bad defensively as you might be led to believe that they are, I still think Ohio State's defense is better than Tennessee's. But Hooker is so dangerous and is playing at such a high level. And when their receivers are healthy, I wonder, so right now, Tennessee is ranked number 1. I don't know if many people would say they really are. If you were doing the neutral field play aliens argument, which I don't like in terms of rankings, but is a fair, I think, general football discussion, I don't know that many people would say, yeah, I'll take Tennessee, right? Go play the aliens, I'll take Tennessee. After Saturday, you might. Like, I think it's possible that the number 1 team in the country might actually show on Saturday that they're the number 1 team in the country, if you know what I mean by that. And that is not taking anything away from Ohio State, but I'm curious just exactly how dangerous this Tennessee offense looks. And, oh, you know what? The defense can hang. The defense can hang. So I think Tennessee's going to win. Like, the line's moving towards them. I picked Tennessee against Alabama. I just think Hooker's that kind of guy. They're healthier on offense. They've gotten some defensive guys back. And I just think this very much might wind up with like Stetson Bennett trying to hang with Hendon Hooker, and I don't think he can. And so I think it's maybe I could see Tennessee even against this Georgia defense, which has been not vulnerable, but not quite as unstoppable as it was a year ago. I could see Tennessee getting into the high 30s or low 40s in this game. And then and I don't exactly know if Georgia's capable of doing that. So I'm probably somewhere like 41-35 range. I'll say that 41-35 Tennessee. What ultimately would be your pick or how you think this breaks down?
Yeah, well, I know we moved on from this a little bit, but, Hendon Hooker has run 44 times, 27 of them scrambles, and out of his 44 runs, 24 of them have gone for first downs.
Oh, look at you with the research, Mr. Big Brain. That's really good.
In the Alabama game, Hendon Hooker scrambled 7 times, 5 first downs. That's the difference, right? That is the difference. Stay on the field, survive in advance against this Georgia defense. Don't take negative plays. That's what it's going to come down to. And look, I think Hendon Hooker's a very good quarterback. I'm not sitting here putting him in, number 2 or 3 in the draft discussion like some people are doing. But he's a really good college quarterback who knows how to take advantage of situations. That's the biggest thing that I can say about this Tennessee team is that they have taken advantage of situations. I think that's what great teams do, especially, by the way, I mean, one thing, again, check out my article on CBSSports.com. This is not a blue chip ratio team. They are the first team out of the 50% blue chip ratio. But the one thing that you do say about them is that they have a few transfers who were blue chips who don't factor into that. They've obviously stayed pretty healthy, which has been a good thing for them. And something that I don't think the blue chip ratio can really take into account is they have multiple 6th-year players and 5th-year players in terms of eligibility. And Hendon Hooker is one of those guys. He's playing his 6th year of college football right now, and it shows. Right? We've been sitting here. I think I made this comparison before, but we've been sitting here wondering, who's the Kenny Pickett of this season? Well, there's 2 guys. I think Dorian Thompson-Robinson at UCLA is one of them. But Hendon Hooker is the other one. He has been that poised, balanced guy who looks like he's too old for college football at this point because he just gets it at a level that nobody else does, I think, at this point. He runs that offense at a very high level. And this, as much as the Alabama game was a Heisman moment, this one probably even more has to be his Heisman moment because I think that he needs to be the difference between those teams. So I think it's a little lower scoring. I think that it's something like 38-27. So very competitive game. Tennessee gets some timely stops. Play some timely defense, as they say, over at over in Raleigh, I guess. And I'm going to take Tennessee to win the game.
You know who, like Hendon Hooker, I'm trying to think, reminds me of a little bit, that is also very much in the football news right now. It's like a little Geno Smith, of a guy who's been around forever, can absolutely sling it, can make plays with his feet when you need it every now and then. And is sort of like, what? Your team is doing what? Because you're so good and we didn't realize it. And so everybody loves that kind of stuff.
I'll give a comp that will only make sense to the 7 Baylor people listening to this. He's supercharged Nick Florence. That's what people outside of Baylor will have no idea who Nick Florence is. He started for 1 year in 2012 after RG3 and actually broke all of RG3's records because he was that productive. He's just a football player, man. He just was an old guy who knew what to do and actually would have probably been the quarterback of the 2013 Big 12 championship team, and Baylor probably would have been better that year if he was there. But the old redshirt rule was in effect, and he had to be thrown into a game because RG3 got a concussion once. So there you go. Nick Florence.
Kind of ground the podcast to a halt right there with the Nick Florence stuff, man. I gotta say, I have no idea what you're talking. So he's a little bit, to me, Hendon Hooker's a little bit of a supercharged Todd Beckman. See, now I can do it too. See,
there we go. Come on, I love it. I love it. How does he compare to Craig Krenzel?
I mean, he is a Steve Belisari if I ever saw it. We're just making stuff up now. So we're both picking Tennessee, and we'll see how that goes. Also, hey, big moment on the road. George is we've been here before. We're good. Stetson Bennett's what's that exactly? That guy who kind of doesn't believe in me up in Ohio. Here's 5 passing touchdowns, obviously on the table. But I just do think, there's a combination here of, we had a conversation earlier this season about, is Georgia better than last year? And then since then, Georgia's been no, we're not better than last year. And we're actually maybe somewhat, and I didn't pick Georgia to make the playoff because I thought somebody would jump up and get them. Now, I didn't think they'd be playing the number 1 team in the playoff rankings in the middle of the regular season. But you look at this, I'm curious. Georgia's still got Kentucky. Georgia's got some stuff. I'm curious to see how it shakes out. So we're both taking Tennessee, and maybe we just like the underdog story. When we come back, we'll do what we actually do on this podcast, which is kick a team out, decide if we should let a team in, and give our rankings. Next on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
So last week, Shehan, we had 10 teams in our rankings, and I didn't even ask the loyal Twitter followers who we should kick out this week because it's so obvious, because Oklahoma State is done. They're out. They got destroyed. Did you see that coming? Just destroyed by Kansas State. And that's it, Mike Gundy. We are done talking about you guys.
I watched that whole game live front to back, and I still can't really explain what happened. That's just one of those games that just a thing happened. You know what I mean? It's just you watch the game, I'm like, man, I don't remember a single play from this game. I don't know what Kansas State did well. I don't know what Oklahoma State did badly. I just looked up and I was like, oh, I guess the game's over, and it's 48-0. So, Oklahoma State's pretty banged up. I thought that they might have the depth to be able to deal with it, but I think that the biggest thing that's hurting them right now is that Spencer Sanders is dealing with a shoulder thing and is just not the same right now. And the backup is a guy named Gunnar Gundy, who happens to be a walk-on. Yeah, I know.
Are we talking about college football nepotism?
That's crazy. Uh-oh. Who could have future Oklahoma State offensive coordinator Gunnar Gundy? Correct. I feel like Mike probably isn't going to go out there and throw out his unprepared son at this point, but I guess that we've seen that in college football before, so who knows.
So they're done. Good run while it lasted. See you later, Oklahoma State. So there wasn't even a discussion. I didn't even bother with the vote because it would be so obvious. I just would have been some snarky joke about who should be kicked out, Oklahoma State or Mike Gundy's old mullet or something. So it's whatever. They're all out. Which brings us down to 9, which is Ohio State, Michigan, Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, Clemson, TCU, Oregon, and USC are the teams that remain in our discussion, which leads us to say, hey, should we let a team in? I gave 4 choices to the Twitter followers, all one-loss teams, because at this point, you make an interesting case for LSU, and maybe there will, if LSU beats Alabama, we'll have to have a discussion. Should LSU re-enter the conversation? At the moment, it's sort of just like, well, if you have 2 losses, like...
Yeah, I don't think they belong in now, to be clear.
We're not doing a ranking. Yeah, we're doing like a playoff. Like, can you make the playoff? And so no matter how good you are, and your losses are reasonable, it's like, well, you have 2 losses, you're not gonna make the playoff. Like, that's the world that we've lived in for 8 years so far. So I did only 1-loss teams. The 4 that I asked about, Shehan: Ole Miss, North Carolina, Illinois, and UCLA. I don't know if you saw the vote. If you did not, do you want to guess who you think won the vote of those 4 1-loss teams?
It's a good question. I don't think it's Ole Miss, nor do I think it should be. Who was the second team again? Ole Miss. North Carolina.
North Carolina, Illinois, and UCLA.
Okay, I think it's between Illinois and UCLA. I'm going to lean Illinois.
That is correct. 34.9% of the Twitter voters picked Illinois, 28.7% UCLA, 25.2% Ole Miss, 11.3% North Carolina. Now, one of the things here is we have rules here, which is somebody has to be kicked out of the playoff discussion every week, and we only kick out 1 team at a time. So we kicked out UCLA a couple weeks ago because somebody had to be kicked out. Listen, I don't make the rules. Actually, I do make the rules, so I could have just rescinded that, but we're living by the rules. So UCLA got kicked out, and it's like, well, why would we be letting them back in right away? It's like, well, they absolutely have a path to the playoffs. Just like you said, Tennessee or TCU probably can't lose and get in. I don't think it's impossible for a 1-loss Pac-12 champ to get in, because you're just going to have enough of the Oregon, USC, Utah stuff that you're going to get some wins that the committee will pay attention to. So I do not think that 1-loss UCLA is out of it by any stretch. They have a regular season game with USC left, and then if they get in the Pac-12 championship game, it's a chance that Pac-12 championship game might be like a top 10 matchup. So they absolutely deserve consideration, even though we just kicked them out. So people, why would you kick them out and put them back in? Because that's what we do here. Illinois is going to play Michigan in the second last game of the regular season, and they are a very similar matchup. Illinois' defense is ranked through the roof, number 1 in the country by some metrics, and they have one of the very best skill players, one of the very best running backs in the country in Chase Brown, and they're kind of just doing their thing. And I thought maybe Nebraska would have a chance to sort of be like, is maybe Illinois is not quite what we think, and then Illinois just took care of business last week. They are an absolutely take care of business kind of team. So, if they beat Michigan, of course they're going to be in our playoff discussion, because all of a sudden it's like, if they beat Michigan, it's like, well, could they beat Ohio State and make the playoff as a 12-1 Big Ten champ with a loss to Indiana? So the question is, do we want to talk about Illinois or UCLA now on the path to that? Who do we think is a more interesting team to deserve to be in the discussion because we think it's more real? And so I'm open to stuff. I'm a little surprised that Illinois won the vote. I thought UCLA might win the vote, but where do you lean here personally, UCLA or Illinois?
I honestly think that I'd be open to both of them. I think that Illinois' path is probably just impossible because they have to play Michigan and probably Ohio State, which just does not feel like a real thing that could happen. And UCLA has to beat USC, and then they'll probably get Oregon in a rematch if they were to beat USC. So, that's manageable. That's real, I guess. So I think that I'd probably lean UCLA, but I think that their cases are honestly pretty similar in that they're probably not going to be that last team let in.
We're open. We can go as high as 12 in our discussion. We're currently at 9. Should we put them both in? Is that reasonable enough that, hey, the Twitter people, they were pretty close on it. 35% to 29%. You know what? Let's just put them both in. That would give us 3 Big Ten teams. That would give us 3 Pac-12 teams. We already have 3 SEC teams, and then we have 1 Big 12 team and 1 ACC team, and that's what the breakdown would be. And then, stuff will shake itself out. Should we just do that? Put them both in?
Yeah, sure. Let's do it.
All right, let's do it. So we'll listen to the Twitter people who piqued our interest. about Illinois, but also like welcome back UCLA. We kind of felt a little bit bad kicking you out to begin with. So that brings us back to 11 teams, which leads us to our rankings. So again, I have a hard time sometimes with what's the thing you call memory. And I can't remember what I did last week. And so I'm going to give myself a break. But I also think like there's the stuff that we do when it's like we're the committee of two. And then it's like, now here's the real committee. And now, okay, now I'm going to think like a committee member. So thinking like a committee member, who is your number one team this week?
I have Tennessee number one. I think that their resume is unimpeachable at this point. They have 2 top 10 wins, though I do not consider LSU to be a real top 10 win. But I still think that even with LSU being more like the 15th best team in the country, those are 2 really good wins and deserve them a spot at number one.
Okay, so I'm sticking with Ohio State because you and I have both had Ohio State number one for the couple weeks in a row. And so I don't know what would have changed to get me off of that, because I do believe that the Penn State experience for Ohio State is more good than bad. That like they worked it out. They wound up winning by whatever it was, 44-31, and that was kind of a backdoor 31. Even though they were trailing when they took the field with 9.5 minutes left in the fourth quarter, when it was winning time, they won against a team that I sort of gained respect for Penn State watching them up close. So that's like Ohio State's best win. They're coming off their best win. And so I had them number one before. And I know Tennessee dominated Kentucky, but also this was like the best sort of version of Ohio State. So, and I've been a resume voter in the past, and I really have. But like committee member, there's a part of this that I don't want to make excuses for Ohio State, but Notre Dame, Wisconsin, and Michigan State like used to be good, and they all fell apart this year. But, they kind of got Wisconsin before they fired the coach. They got Notre Dame when Notre Dame was at least healthy, and they shut down what Notre Dame does best, even though they had to work it out there. They do have the best offense. Their defense is ranked pretty high. They're more balanced than Tennessee, and it's on the razor's edge, but I'm going to lean Ohio State, and then I'll have the Tennessee-Georgia winner number one next week, because then that, to me, changes the game. So I have Ohio State 1, Tennessee 2. You have Tennessee 1, Ohio State 2.
Yes.
Who do you have 3?
I have Georgia 3.
So do I, and I don't know that was the committee said it's a 3-team discussion for number one. Georgia, I think, would have a case for number one. I don't think it's as strong as the other 2 cases, but you could make it. I'm sure there's probably somebody in that committee room who thinks they're number one, because guess what? They're number one in both polls, right? I mean, it's like, which again, everybody's like, oh, all the committee does it. The committee does not look at the polls because the polls are bad. So like, again, if you need proof, it's like Georgia's number 3, and the polls have number 1. All right, number 4. Who do you have number 4?
I have Michigan 4.
So do I. Who do you have 5?
Clemson.
So do I. Who do you have 6?
TCU.
So do I. Who do you have 7?
Alabama.
So do I. Who do you have 8?
Oregon.
So do I. Who do you have 9?
UCLA.
Oh, UCLA ahead. Okay. I had USC. Yep. Who do you have 10?
I have USC 10.
And then 11 is Illinois. So we're basically, we disagree at the top 1, 2. We disagree on 9, 10. I think is this a reasonable, I feel a little bad for the Big 12, but the Big 12 did it. Kansas State did this. If Kansas State had not lost to Tulane, Kansas State would be in our discussion. So they're probably good. I don't want to do the same thing the committee did, which is like, look at the Big 12, be like, hey, you have a lot of good teams. So your best team is 7th. Your undefeated best team is 7th. I don't want to look at the Big 12 and be like, hey, you have a lot of good teams. Only 1 team's in our playoff mix. But I'm not sure who else we're supposed to have in right now. We're not going to have Texas. We're not going to have Kansas State with 2 losses.
Yeah, no, there's no other teams that can make the playoff from the Big 12. I said this heading into the year, actually, that we were supposed to, on our Big 12 preview, we were supposed to do bold predictions. And my bold prediction coming into the year, which I think is aging pretty well right now, though, maybe we'd have to tweak the numbers a little bit, was that the Big 12 is not going to get a team into the playoff, but they would have 3 top 10 teams, and none of them would be Texas or Oklahoma.
My goodness, that is a very specifically bold prediction that might come true.
Yeah, so I'll extend it out to top 15. I don't think that it's going to be top 10, but Kansas State, Oklahoma State, TCU right now, all very legitimate teams that are going to be in the top 15 discussion at the end of the year. None, I still don't think Because I don't think that TCU can survive a loss, and I just don't think they can finish the year without a loss. It's just a very difficult schedule for them to finish. And also, by the way, I'm not saying that the past determines the future, but Sonny Dykes is known for his incredibly fast starts to the year and incredibly slow finishes to the year during his time at SMU. That's not to say that they're going to lose multiple games or anything like that, but it's just going to be really hard, I think. So I don't think that the Big 12 ultimately gets a team to the playoff, and there's not another team that deserves to be in this discussion, even though I think that the Big 12 from 1 to 10 is probably the most competitive conference that we've seen in a little while.
Ask him if he wants to be on the show. Sonny.
Sonny? Sonny would absolutely do this show. He is like the most media-friendly coach in America.
Yeah, let's ask him. If TCU, let's ask about like life in this, right? You're in a good conference, but you're trying to get respect, and maybe he'll go off about being ranked behind Bama. Yeah. Sonny Dykes Show. Next Wednesday on the College Football Survivor Show. Shehan's on it. All right. Thanks, you guys, for listening. Go read Shehan again. What's the headline on your story that you were referencing? This Georgia-Tennessee story that people should seek out. They can put it in the Google machine and it'll pop right up.
Yeah, I didn't know what to headline it, so they're good. I put in a very here's the LSU versus Tennessee comparison. So maybe just look up LSU Tennessee comparison CBS.
My mother was texting me and my sister last night from her tablet, and she texted, "Thanks again, y'all." And she's from Pennsylvania. And she actually is her family's Pennsylvania Dutch, which is borderline Amish. They definitely don't say y'all.
Wait. So you have Pennsylvania Dutch heritage?
Yeah. No. Yeah. I went to visit my mom for the Penn State game, and we went to a farmer's market. It was absolutely spectacular. But there were probably 50 Amish people working the farmer's market. And I asked one of the people, I asked them where the restroom was. And when they told me, they kind of had a little bit of a German accent because they speak Pennsylvania Dutch in the home.
Yeah, no, Dwight Schrute did a lot to bring awareness of your heritage.
No, for real. Thank you to Dwight. So my mom would definitely not say y'all. But then the next thing she typed was, "I am scared of my tablet." That she she was like, "Who typed that? Why did my tablet type y'all?" So it can be a very, the Google machine can be very dangerous. Be careful out there with your tablets and your cell phones and anything that stuff starts typing.
I did not realize that tablets were Southern. That's crazy.
Yeah. Who knew? I mean, it's just an algorithm. I mean, you just put it in and it's your tablet probably has a name. He or she has a background, a whole backstory. Came up there. My mom's tablet might be a Tennessee fan. So who do you know? I mean, how would we know?
Your mom's tablet.
Yeah. My mom's tablet is super excited about Georgia, Tennessee. My mom will be like, "Play Doug's podcast." And it'll just be playing Tennessee, Georgia highlights and talking about the tablet. Will want to talk about Stetson Bennett the whole time. So maybe we could have the tablet on as a guest. If we can't get Sonny Dykes, we'll have my mom's tablet on to talk about the outcome of Georgia, Tennessee. So go watch that game, see if we're wrong. We'll come back next week and dissect that, what it tells us about the playoff. I do think we didn't really mention this. One of the other things we know for sure now is if Tennessee loses to Georgia and Michigan loses to Ohio State, if there is a battle for the 4 spot, Tennessee's going to beat out Michigan. Not that we didn't maybe anticipate that, but if you were trying to have a 2 Big Ten versus 2 SEC, that gap between Tennessee and Michigan is pretty wide. If Tennessee and Michigan win and the battles between Ohio State and Georgia for the 4 spot, then we're in for something, I think. Then it could get really interesting. But if it's Tennessee, Michigan, we'll know that. So go read Shehan's story. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to it so you don't miss an episode. If you want to be an Apple Podcast subscriber, you get 4 bonus episodes a month for $3. Kind of a good deal. And be a Twitter follower at CFB Survivor Show. Enjoy Tennessee, Georgia this weekend. For Shehan Jeyarajah, I'm Doug Lesmerises, and that was the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.